This episode of The Orthodox Conundrum is sponsored by the Eden Project by Rotem Shani, located on Hasavion Street, right across from the Scheinfeld neighborhood in the city in which I live, Beit Shemesh. The Eden Project has the best of two worlds, as it's in a convenient and central location with easy access to religious ganim, schools, shuls, and shopping, while also being surrounded by trees and parks that overlook the scenic Elah Valley. The development will include 5 beautifully designed and spacious apartment buildings. And this isn't just a typical complex. This is a community that will be nurtured by a shul with a wonderful rabbinic couple. As I've mentioned before, I am so pleased that Rabbi and Rebbetzin Benny and Chani Krohn of the Young Israel of Teaneck will be making aliyah and leading the spiritual development of this project in order to create a kehillah with an unwavering commitment to Torah values, Ahavat Yisrael, and the core principles of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. The Krohns are a wonderful and beloved rabbinic family, and I'm really excited to watch how much their being part of the Eden Project will make this development unique and religiously impactful. For more information, please contact Rena Weinberg by emailing info@edenbeitshemesh.com. That's info at edenbeitshemesh.com. You can find the link in the description of this podcast.
If you're honest with yourself, then you have to admit that really and truly, if a gun was put to your head, what is going to happen to this patient in 6 months? You don't know. You can say, I know as much as I can know. I know what the statistics show, but you don't know. And the way you don't know is if you practice as long as I did and you see people decades later, you realize how many times you would have imagined that somebody that you knew then would turn out. They didn't.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. What is it like for a doctor who has spent his life treating patients to become a patient himself? This was the experience of Dr. Avi Rockoff when he learned that he had a very serious form of prostate cancer, and which he chronicles in his new book, When the Doctor Becomes the Patient. Avi was exposed to what he terms the medical industrial complex from the other side of the physician's desk, and he learned about some of the aspects of healthcare that he had taught for years, but from a very different perspective. I found this conversation both fascinating and important, and I've been thinking about it and discussing it with people ever since I recorded it. Avi and I talked about the common reluctance of patients to talk about their conditions with friends and family, the limits of the doctor's expertise, why it's possible that not knowing about an illness can sometimes be better than knowing about it and treating it, why offering compassion and hope are essential components of a healer's job, and why that healer should not be seen as just some type of repairman, some of the positives and negatives of the way that medicine has become streamlined, differences between his experience as a patient in Boston versus his treatment in Israel, what gave him encouragement during his illness, how we should speak with friends and family who are ill, and more. Some of these topics are especially resonant to me because a very close friend of mine recently was diagnosed with cancer. Many of you know him, Rabbi Jonathan Cohen, Harav Yehonatan Eitan HaKohen Ben Batsheva Bracha. Our family and the Cohens spend Purim together annually, alternating hosting the Purim Suda every year, and our friendship with Jonathan, Sivia, and their kids is an absolute gift. Jonathan is a wonderful and caring friend to hundreds of people. I don't think I ever met anyone who was so beloved by so many different individuals in so many different places. For that reason, I want to dedicate this episode with Dr. Avi Rockoff in honor of Jonathan and with a prayer for his refuah shlema. I ask everyone listening to please include Yehonatan Eitan Ben Batsheva Bracha in your tefillot for a speedy and complete recovery. We'll begin the episode in just a minute. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com, and let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Dr. Avi Rockoff and his wife Julie recently made Aliyah to Yerushalayim, and before that lived for decades in Newton, Massachusetts, where they and my parents had a very warm friendship. Avi was the assistant chief of pediatrics at Mount Sinai Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut from 1975 through 1977, and had a private practice in dermatology in Brookline and Andover, Massachusetts from 1979 until 2023. He was also assistant clinical professor at the Tufts University School of Medicine for 35 years. My dad used to describe Avi to me with genuine admiration, calling him a Renaissance man who could do so many things well. It was my real pleasure to speak with Avi about his knowledge, wisdom, and experiences. Dr. Avi Rockoff, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I'd like to open by hearing the story of your transition from being a doctor to being a patient. What happened?
That's it. That's basically what happened. I've had various medical issues over the years, but they were not, thankfully, serious ones. I practiced medicine for many years, some pediatrics, mostly dermatology. And so it was all relatively low key. Most people with dermatology issues don't have life-threatening conditions. And when they do, the community dermatologist, that would be me, makes the diagnosis perhaps, but then sends them on to specialists for special care. But most routine medicine, this is true for primary physicians as well, many other physicians, it's things that you take care of over a period of time. And so one of the things that has always interested me is trying to figure out how patients thought about their own illness. And the reason I was interested, besides being curious, was because it seemed to me, and I always pointed this out to the students I had with me most of the years I was working, that you don't really understand what people are thinking unless we try to get into their heads. And the reason it matters and is not presented in medical school or any professional school this way, you're a professional, you're supposed to be the expert that people are consulting, and you're supposed to tell them. Well, that may work if you're an accountant because your clients will not argue with you about whether something is tax deductible most of the time. But when you're a physician, you're taking care of people who have all kinds of notions about what's wrong with them and how it got that way. And if what you say does not make sense to them, they may nod at you out of politeness, or they may argue with you in public, most of the time the former, but they're not going to do it. And then when you find out the next time that they didn't take the medicine, they didn't put the cream in, and you have to ask yourself why that happened. Anyway, so I had the opportunity to think about that and gain whatever knowledge I got from the exercise. However, when I became sick myself, I realized that many of the thoughts that went through my mind were the same ones that went through my patients' minds. But it's like a lot of experiences, people can tell you at great length about what it feels like to be in love, but until you actually are, what do you really know? And I think that's a reasonable analogy. So there's fear, there's confusion, there's anger, there's all sorts of things that you can describe, but you really have to feel them in order to understand what they are.
Are there any particular discoveries you can still articulate that you can actually say that you thought one way, but after the experience of being a patient, after many years of being the physician, you've learned that are quite different, something you can share that maybe you wish you had known when you were practicing as a doctor?
Well, one of the things that I realized from meeting with patients had illnesses or conditions that were annoying, sometimes scary, but things that could be dealt with. And the two big questions that people who study this say that every patient has is why me and why now? Now, those are easy to articulate, but they conjure an image of somebody in a hair shirt standing on a mountaintop, extending his arms toward the heavens and saying, "Oh, why me and why now?" And that's true, but it's also true for people who have acne, or people who have eczema, or people who have psoriasis. People never discuss those because they're not fun to talk about, because they don't raise eternal questions. So what was the reaction of patients when all of a sudden their skin, which had never bothered them before, and they always treated them nicely, all of a sudden started breaking out with these ugly rashes? So the questions people always had was, what is this? Why is my body up to now so reliable doing this to me? And what did I ever do to it? And since I'm speaking to you, I can say it's very much the question that the donkey asked Dilron. Said, like, I've been your donkey all this time. Why are you doing this? And the question, of course, was reversed, because Dilron was wondering, like, you were always a nice donkey. What is this? So in other words, it's an expression of astonishment and irritation. And those were what I knew to expect from people, and I couldn't answer all their questions, but I could at least understand where they were coming from. In my own particular case, I had something very serious indeed, but I still asked the same question. And the question was, I'm a good boy. I listen to my doctors. I go for my screening tests every year. And one of the things I point out in the book is screening tests are tricky. Women who deal with breast cancer or the threat of it are aware of this very well, because screening tests can discover things that you were better off not knowing, leading you to have tests and surgeries that you didn't need and might suffer from. With prostate cancer, which is what I have, the test that's done, it's widely known, is called the PSA, prostate surface antigen. And it's a blood test, and it doesn't prove that you have prostate cancer, but it suggests that if the number goes up, that maybe something is going on, resulting in a test. And that actually happened to me like 12, 15 years before, and the test was negative. But this time, after having been stable for a very long time, the PSA went up just a little bit. And then one thing led to the other, and the reassurances the doctor, whom I knew for a long time at that point, told me rapidly evaporated. And all of a sudden, I was faced with not just prostate cancer, but like the worst kind of prostate cancer. It's graded on 1 to 10. I had a 10. It was 9, and they upgraded it, Mazel tov. And so the question was, and one other point which I mentioned in the book is, when I was 72, 4 years before diagnosis, my primary physician said, don't get any more PSAs, because it has been shown not to help for the reasons I just suggested. You might find out something you would be better off not knowing, and much prostate cancer is ignorable in many cases. You never have to treat it, or you have to do something very limited. So she said, don't get any more PSAs. So I called my urologist, whom I knew long ago, and he said, keep getting PSAs. So obviously there are differences of opinion. I decided to go with my urologist because it was a urological question. I was aware that there may be different ways of analyzing the data, and I didn't, since it's not my field, I decided not to try to do my own research, as people say nowadays. At any rate, so I continued to get the PSA tests, and it went up a bit, and before you know it, here we are. And where was I? I was with not just regular prostate cancer, but the worst kind of prostate cancer, even though I was doing the test every year. And this struck me the way illness strikes patients all the time, serious or not. It's not fair. I moisturize my skin. I eat right, even though eating right doesn't help your acne, but everybody thinks it does. In other words, I do the stuff that society or the articles I read or the doctors I see or the friends I know, I'm doing all the good stuff. Now, this sounds like the problem of Tzaddik Varallo. In fact, it is the problem of Tzaddik Varallo, except in secular terms. But however you define it, most people have secularized brains, including me, and we can talk about that later, because I often use religious terminology, and all the chapters in my book have Hebrew epigraphs, And I make it very clear in the book that I am not staking out any theological position. I'm not assuming anything or recommending anything theological to anybody. What I am doing is quoting sources which are familiar to those of us who study them, which seem to me to be very full of wisdom and suggestions of wisdom that can apply to anybody. You can quote a philosopher if you want to. I would rather quote the Tanakh, but it's not because I am making a statement about Jewish theology or any other theology. What I'm saying is, like every patient, like almost all the patients I met, and including me, the question was, "No, you told me not to get a PSA. I got it anyway. Then I found out, among other things, if I didn't take the PSA, I wouldn't even know I was sick." That's a separate question, which is worth talking about, but not at the moment. And I said, like, it's not fair. Of course, screening tests don't prevent you from getting sick, but everybody knows that it's supposed to make it more easy to treat because you're supposed to be able to catch it early. Now, that may be true in a statistical sense, but I'm an N of one. I'm the only one involved in this particular question. So what I'm saying is that the thought process that I'm describing, I was very familiar with from practically every patient I ever saw. Some of them articulated it more forcefully and some less. But in my case, suddenly I was faced with it myself, as I was saying before about other emotional states. It ain't the same until it's you.
And knowing that now, would that change the way that you would relate to a patient now that you have gone through it, even though it's not something which can be articulated, but having the experience that changed the way you think about a patient, for example?
Well, I would like to think that, as I've already mentioned, that this was always a matter of interest. And I taught all my students this, that as much as I could understand it, I did understand it and tried to act accordingly. But of course, the question has a different valence if you're asking why I have a pimple. And by the way, I don't in any way mean to minimize that. Until you actually meet patients who won't go to school because they have one pimple, you don't really get how much it means to somebody, even though to the professional world or to the world at large, it seems like the merest triviality. So I would say that I knew all about this stuff, but there was no way I could know it. I mean, would I have acted differently as a doctor? Probably not. But it's because I tried to address that anyway. But it still wasn't the same when it was me. And one of the things that I found when I entered what has been termed the medical industrial complex, that there was really no one to talk to about questions like this. They don't come up in ordinary medical interactions, not because the people involved, I'm talking about the professionals, are insensitive. Some of them may be, but the way the profession is structured, certainly in the way that I encountered it, there was no room for any questions of this kind, even to mention them, even though there are no answers that can be given, but merely to express them the way I'm expressing them to you now.
I'll get back to that soon. I want to get into that PSA test and the ignorance issue, because you talk about that. You have one chapter subtitled, speaking of the verses, is Ignorance Bliss, and the pasuk you put there is, "As for the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die." And you talk about a conversation with a particular radiation oncologist. You asked this person, "Am I better off because I know?" And he answered, "Possibly."
Yes.
Now, before you were talking about not knowing for things that you can't treat anyway, but yours, obviously, you were able to treat. And I'd like to understand that a little bit better. Why would someone say that taking a test that helps you discover that you have cancer and it is treatable, why is the answer, is it better that I know that, not yes? Why is it only maybe?
That's life.
What do you mean?
That is, just as rabbis didn't tell the public everything there was about to know about halakha because the public couldn't handle it. The question that I asked, no patient would ask that question because it's too threatening. Why do you go to a healer? Why do you go to a doctor? Because you think that the doctor can help. First of all, just imagine the dynamic. You say to the doctor you have a treatment, you think it's going to help me. Am I better off going to you, or should I just go home and watch TV? Who's going to ask such a question? Well, I mean, it might tell you something about the person's personality, but a person who wants to be helped is not going to turn to the helper and say, really? How do I know? Now, the reason I ask that is because as a physician, I am well aware that the best efforts, I don't mean that they don't work. I mean that in an existential sense, you have no way of knowing for sure that what you're doing is better. You can say that patients who are treated with this regimen do better than people who are not, but you don't have a way to do a controlled study of people who never came to you at all. It can't be done. So it's a gap in what may be known. So I asked it with malice aforethought because I was going to go for the treatment. I wasn't looking for an out, but I wanted to know what they would say if I asked them the question that pretty much nobody else would ask them. Like, how about if I didn't get this? You would think, well, I mean, if you don't treat it, is it going to spread? And the answer is maybe. But there are all these cases you read about that are usually described as miracles, where people don't treat it, or what you know the kind of story I mean. People love reading those stories, and they say, "Oh, the doctors didn't know." They're right. The doctors didn't know because nobody knows. Nobody can predict the future. I actually gave private kudos to the doctor for answering me as bluntly as he did, because it's not just a question of knowledge. It's a question of, like, I'm a professional and I'm admitting to you, which he did, that maybe what we're doing is healthy. And that I firmly believe that to be the truth. I would never say that to a patient. I mean, if there was a question of the treatment being dangerous, that's a different story. But if we're talking about a life-threatening illness that you really are going to treat, you're not going to say, I'm not looking for an out, then as a physician, I would never say, you know what, if you don't treat your acne at all, it might go away tomorrow. Because, it could. I've seen it. When did I see it? If a patient came with very, very severe acne, I'm talking terrible acne, and the mother would not let the patient get the medicine. So you would assume if you don't treat it, then there'll be scarring, there'll be emotional consequences, and then you come to find out, usually by accident, because the patient doesn't come back. You see them again 6 months or a year later. Where's the acne? Now, does that mean I would not treat acne in the future? Of course not. But if you're honest with yourself, then you have to admit that really and truly, if a gun was put to your head, what is going to happen to this patient in 6 months? You don't know. You can say, I know as much as I can know. I know what the statistics show, but you don't know. And the way you don't know is if you practice as long as I did, and you see people decades later, you realize how many times you would have imagined that somebody that you knew then would turn out. They didn't. Now, it's nice to talk about this in a theoretical sense if the patient has eczema. But a person who is theoretically going to, or could very well die, then, it's not a theoretical question. So that was kind of a side point. It doesn't change anything about the way I think doctors should act or say. You don't want to tell somebody, well, to be perfectly honest, I don't know if anything will matter, because that's nihilistic. And that's not really what the patient coming to a healer needs to hear. That's not compassion or honesty. That's actually offensive stupidity. But I asked him because I wanted to know. I had my own thing on it.
Then, given what you just said, how important is it to tell patients everything? Meaning, in general, we talk about freedom of information and a patient's right to know. Do you think that's actually the right thing to do? Or is it sometimes a smart idea to withhold in order to maintain that compassion and that hopefulness? Because it sounds like sometimes that nihilistic doctor is saying, well, this might do absolutely nothing. I don't know if it's worth it. That might be the most honest answer.
Hard question to answer in general terms. I'll start by saying, whatever you do, you need to have seichel. That's true of professionals of all kinds, including the clergy. You certainly don't tell people things that are not the case, just to give them hope, because that's lying to them. But there are ways of conveying that information without just coming out, blurting out that there's nothing that can be done, or I don't really know. There are ways of saying it that are entirely honest and yet leave room for hope. And I think that in a meaningful sense, the doctors who spoke to me, they didn't mince any words. They said that the cure rate for what you have is probably 50%. Of course, what cure means is a separate issue, but leaving that aside. I said if you do certain things that we will add to it, it might increase it to 2/3. But even lack of cure is not necessarily, as one of my doctors put it, it's not necessarily curtains, because not being cured, as people know nowadays, because so many cancers are in fact treated as chronic diseases, there are things to be done. Eventually, there may be nothing to be done. But not to sound melancholy, that's life. Eventually, life ends. You do what you can until then. So there's no room for dishonesty. There's no room for fudging. But there is room for a careful and compassionate way of providing the facts in a way that gives people something to hold on to and a treatment plan to accept.
I'm going to ask the question, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but I think it's important to ask it anyway.
Sure.
Why does a doctor's job include empathy and compassion and giving hope? Isn't that the clergy person's job, the spouse's job, the children's, the parents' job? A doctor's job is, as you put it, to be a healer, and presumably a healer of the body more than the healer of the soul. So given that, why does it matter for a doctor to give hope? His job is a technician to come in and fix it.
Well, I think you very, very nicely articulated the way doctors are looked at now. But until maybe the last fifth of the 19th century, doctors couldn't really do anything for all those millennia. Now, when I say they couldn't do anything, I mean they couldn't do anything in the modern sense of doing something. What is the modern sense of doing something? It is evidence-based, statistically validated treatment. So first of all, I practiced medicine all the years, and you would be surprised at how few times statistically validated evidence comes into play. What I mean is, what do people actually come to doctors for? What do you think I did all day? First of all, I told a significant chunk that they don't have what they were worried they had. Then I told another chunk that they did have what they worried they had, but it wasn't as bad as they thought it was. Why did they think that? Because Aunt Tilly had the same thing, the same mole, and then so on and so forth. So people tell themselves stories, and I help talk them out of their own stories. Now, having said that, there certainly are situations, and my own case was one of them, where there is statistically validated evidence that tells you what's better to do than what's not. But even when there is statistically validated evidence, there's a lot of wiggle room. There's a lot of gaps. And I write about that in the book at length, because most of the studies that people, not even today, base treatment on, like the treatment I had, how much radiation, when to do surgery, how many other pills to take, is based upon studies that were done 5 years ago, 6 years ago, before they invented PET scans. PET scans are scans which can see all kinds of good stuff in the body that nobody could see before. And in my own case, the question is, are there metastases? Did the cancer spread outside the capsule of the prostate? And which treatment you do depends on whether that's true or not, okay? But after PET scans, all kinds of people who were clear turned out not to be. So there'll be more studies and there will be clarified things. But in the meantime, the doctor who's there being the technician has to use what Jewish judges call shikol hadat. You have to use judgment because the data is not complete. What about me? I had a tumor which 5 years ago would not have been found to be outside the capsule at all. And therefore, maybe I would have been a candidate for surgery. But then this PET scan showed that I had 2 little measly nodes, outside little tumor things in the pelvis. Now, they weren't all over the body. So anyway, so the thing is, The people assume that doctors are providing scientific treatment, and they are. But there are many, many aspects to medical care which are not scientifically validatable. They just aren't. How many days should you take antibiotics for an infection? There's a number that they give you, but the data that it's based upon is very shaky. Plus, go back before 1880. All those centuries, all those millennia. In the Torah, it says, Ani Hashem Rofecha, I am your healer. What did patients think they were getting then? They certainly weren't getting scientifically validated treatment because nobody even knew what that was. One of the quotes in the front of the book, in the fly leaf of the book, is from a doctor in the last half of the 19th century who ran a tuberculosis sanitarium in upstate New York. And he wrote, to heal sometimes, to improve sometimes, to comfort always. Now, he was treating tuberculosis patients before there were antibiotics for tuberculosis. The germ theory disease hadn't been accepted yet. So what was he doing for people in the sanitarium? He was doing what they knew how to do, light therapy, air, whatever it was. But they thought that was the best that they knew how to do. But part of going to a healer is to have somebody figuratively, if not literally, put their hand on your shoulder and say, I'm with you. Now, that's not a new concept. I mean, it's a very, very old concept. And people used to talk about it a lot in the medical profession, but they don't talk about it so much anymore, not because people are less compassionate than they used to be by their nature. But what I have found, to my surprise, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book, is that it's kind of bled out of the system so that even if people are compassionate, they're not in a position to express it. By that I mean, and as you know, since you read the book, you go to a big medical center, you see somebody, you don't know who's in charge. Is it the radiation guy? Is it the oncology guy? It's all new to me. In fact, I was a dermatologist, told me nothing about any of that. And you see a doctor, and then the next time, you don't see the doctor, you see somebody else. Now, I'm not opposed to nurse practitioners and physician assistants. I trained and worked with them for decades, so I'm all in favor of them. So I'm not describing them as less competent, but that they're different. So you see Dr. A, then you see Nurse B, then you see Dr. C, and in fact, you realize slowly but surely that as far as the system is concerned, you never have to see the same doctor again in your entire life. You can finish the entire course of treatment without ever seeing the same person. So, how compassionate can you be if you never see the person again? I mean, what are you going to say? The point is, it's a process. Now, when I came to Israel, and I didn't do this as a controlled experiment, that's where my wife was. We had come on Aliyah. I was diagnosed back in Boston. And of course, Boston is the center of the medical universe, the hub, as they like to call it. So I didn't know, which I know now, that I could have gotten the same treatment here in Israel. I didn't know that. How would I know that? What does good mean? How could I have measured it? I had no idea. So I was exposed to the American medical system, and it was competent in its own way. And then I came to Israel, and a friend of mine referred me to a doctor at Shaarei Tzedek just because I needed to have somebody to talk to when I was in town, because we were still going back and forth at that point. And I found somebody who was really all there, and I see him every time I see him. Now, I love irony. Not everybody appreciates that, but I do. And that is part of the reason I see the same person every time. And my daughter, who's a nurse here, tells me that my experience is by no means universal in Israel, is because there aren't enough physician assistants in Israel. They haven't invented them yet here. So like there's nobody else to lean on. So ironically, I'm seeing the same person, but because I'm seeing the same person, I can develop a relationship. Is the relationship statistically validatable to show that it's going to make me live longer? No, you can't quantify compassion. Do I think it's an important part of medicine? Of course I do, because that's what I did for 40 years. because I practiced as a solo practitioner in my own office, which is now an extinct species, but it worked at the time.
It's such an interesting insight. When I was reading your book, that was something I really did notice. The fact I'm thinking of Dr. K, that's the name you gave to one doctor, who gave you exactly 30 minutes to the second. And then you came to Israel and met with Dr. A, and Dr. A said that he had to, I don't remember if it was postpone your appointment or he could only meet you later on because he had to spend 2 or 3 hours with a patient whose condition was dire. And you said that kind of attitude, not because of a lack of compassion, but because of what you called before the medical industrial complex, the mechanization of medicine, it just wouldn't happen in a place like Boston.
The system is literally set up to make it all but impossible to develop a relationship. That was my experience. Maybe it's not everybody's experience, but I talked about it with colleagues in the States. And what's come to happen is what they call the team approach, which sounds very egalitarian. And that's part of the motivation for it. And part of it can be shown to actually increase the efficiency in aspects of care. And in many cases, it's fine. If you have your appendix taken out, you don't have to develop a warm relationship with your surgeon. You only have one appendix. You're not going to see him again or her. So I can't say that it's, that there are good reasons why medicine has evolved in the way it does. I go into that in the book, but without going into detail, thing is, if you have a hangnail, if you have a cyst on your fingernail, okay, fine. You see the doctor, you like them, you don't like them, but what difference? It doesn't make that much difference. But when you're suddenly confronted with existential questions that nobody can answer, not your rabbi, not your doctor, but at least you can have somebody theoretically to talk to about them, or at least to get to know them as a human being who's going to see you the next time, unless that's possible, and suddenly you're confronted with your possibly, maybe not imminent, but not too far away demise, then wait a minute, this is all there is?
It reminds me a bit of something which I told you about before we started recording. I'd sent you something which I'd seen on my Facebook page, a clip from a doctor show or maybe a movie where the doctor came in with a horrible bedside manner. And when the patient grew frustrated, the other physicians in the room said to the frustrated patient, "What would you prefer, a friend or a really good doctor?" And the obvious answer was better to have a really good doctor. And you're saying it doesn't really work that way in real life.
No, it doesn't even come close to working that way. Thinking back to my debating days, what you just described is what is called a false dilemma. It's positing, well, you can have this or you can have that. But that's nonsense. That's not even close to being true. Anybody can realize that from their own experience. The idea is only somebody who's a jerk can possibly be competent. Is that what the argument is? And the answer is, of course it isn't. You can say, being a jerk doesn't even help. But so that's just a rhetorical ploy. It's not a real fact. There were aspects of the interactions which go beyond personality. I mentioned that, and I mentioned that in the book, that when I went to this major cancer center, they wanted to put me on a study. And the study was to test whether this drug or that drug and so forth. And it was impossible, given my medical experience, because I remember this from when I was training all the years ago, is that, who's the doctor working for? You want somebody who's working for you. So what does that mean? Who else might the doctor be working for? Well, for their department, for their academic luster, for the drug company that's paying for the study. And that's a really pretty icky feeling when it's being presented to you. And as I said, in the book, when I met the doctor here in Israel, he looked at me. It was really very interesting because he had a great deal of respect for the noble people in Boston. But he said, if that study came before my department, I would reject it as unethical. Now, with all due respect, it's not that clear cut. Studies, everybody knows about the horrendous studies that were done decades ago. There's all kinds of safeguards. There's the institutional review boards. So I'm not making accusations that it was unethical. But in my particular case, I was saying, here I am, I'm lost. I don't know this field. I don't know you. I don't know you. I never met you before. I'm never going to see you again, it turns out. So I'm not a suspicious person, but who am I talking to? And then you say, well, you should go in the study. and maybe it'll help and maybe it won't. And that's a fair point, because every research study you can ask that about. But basically, I had an unpleasant feeling that this was really not the best thing for me, and that the person I was speaking to was serving two masters, and I was only one of them. And that's not a good feeling, regardless of whether you have a sense about whether the nuts and bolts of the study are valuable or not. And by the way, his entire personality changed once I resigned from the study. He became like a different person, because he was trying to sell me something he didn't believe in. When you have a severe disease, you really want to find out, like, who are you? At least in the sense of knowing, are you on my team, or are there several teams in the field and I'm just one?
Why are you suggesting this to me? Is it because of what I need or because of what you need?
Yes, exactly. And of course, very few people will confront a doctor in the room. I can tell you from experience that some people will. But I'm not the kind of person who's going to say, I don't believe you, I don't trust you. And besides which, what would I be doing if I said something like that? Like, who am I going to work with if not you? I'm here. So there's all kinds of reasons why it constrains your response.
I want to go back to the issue of compassion and empathy, but move it slightly to a different parallel idea of hope. I'm wondering how much a doctor should offer hope. Meaning, should a doctor generally be optimistic? Should he be very, very even-keeled and say what the case is, even if he does it compassionately? And to what degree is that being honest if he's supposed to offer hope?
Mitat haracham and mitat hadin. If you have a doctor who says, that's it. And by the way, the radiation oncologist in my initial meeting with him, he evinced nothing that you would call, didn't present it that it was hopeless. He didn't say it was hopeless, but there was no vibe of sympathy and empathy. As I came to know him a little bit later on, it's not important to go into now, I saw that it was really more there. But under the circumstances, when somebody is talking to you and not barely giving you a chance to respond, drawing pictures and telling you, at one point I said to him, Doctor, I have a question, but you may not be able to answer precisely. And he said, I can answer all questions. We have all the data. So I thought to myself, what exactly am I going to argue about with this individual, especially right now when he's telling me what to do? So I just dropped it. But that was a bit of a caricature situation. Most people are not like that, but some people are. But you asked about hope. You give people the hope that the situation permits you to give. You don't promise what you can't, but if you can promise something that's not totally essential, then you can do so. It's the same kind of common sense approach that anybody giving counseling to anybody about anything, any kind of therapist, any kind of clergyman, any friend who's giving, you're not going to say, oh, everything's going to be fine with your relationship and so forth, because you don't know that. But you can find a way to put not a spin, but a sense that there is something to hope for. And I found that they did do that. So the same doctor who said he couldn't be sure that I was better off for knowing, he did start by saying that my 5-year survival rate was expected to be 100%. To which I replied that I cross busy streets. He said, okay, 99%. Humor is helpful if you can manage it.
Let me ask you about hope. One more question about this. And perhaps this is not something which relates directly to your situation, but perhaps more as a physician. Are there ways a doctor can give hope to someone who has a terminal illness? And admittedly, life is terminal, but I mean one where the demise is somewhat imminent. Is there still room to give hope? Perhaps not in terms of a cure, but in other ways?
I can't speak from medical experience because the people I dealt with were not terminal. I can say that in my own case, where there is a significant risk of dying from the condition, but not necessarily when that would be, that the people who spoke to me did, in fact, speak in terms which allowed for hope. In other words, they'd say, no, you're gone, that's it. The data didn't support that. I mean, severe prostate cancer is not severe esophageal cancer. So I wasn't in that circumstance, and not having actually dealt with people in terminal situations, I hesitate to say much because I haven't been there.
Okay. I want to switch gears and ask you about something which you wrote in your book. You talk about how people who are ill are often afraid to open up to friends and family. And I'm curious if you can explain why that is. I think that they would want to open up to friends and family.
Well, you asked me in one of your questions why I wrote the book, and I wrote it for a number of reasons, some of which are there are things that I've thought about, but I've really not had an opportunity to discuss with anybody. For instance, hypochondria. I have been a card-carrying hypochondriac since I was a teenager, that I recall, maybe even earlier. And of course, I dealt with many hypochondriacs, and my experience as a hypochondriac really helped me deal with people because I knew exactly where they were coming from, and I knew how to calm them down for at least 24 to 48 hours. Now, so that was one thing that I learned. What I learned in my own particular case is that my hypochondria went away when I had something real to worry about. And then when things started to improve a bit, then it came back. So we're all right. The other thing is that the question you're asking about opening up to other people. So opening up to other people, that's something that I had a chance to really ponder. I have a couple of strikes against me in terms of opening up to anybody about anything. One is I'm male. Men don't talk about feelings. And when they do try to, the men they try to talk to will look at them as though they have lapsed into Hungarian. They move on. Second thing is I have been a doctor all these years. Now, a doctor is a social role, among other things. And it means you're the kind of person who takes care of people. And so your job is if the patient comes to you, I used to tell my students all this, but in the days before the internet, don't bring a textbook into the examining room. It's not a good look. And early in my career, I was very humble. I admitted my ignorance. And mothers, I was a pediatrician at the time, looked at me like, why did I come to you? What am I doing here? So I realized that humility has its place and arrogance does not, but you have to use it in the proper way. So when you're used to acting the whole life as though you're in charge, it takes work to admit that you aren't. But in addition to that, and by the way, I found that when I did open up to people, it was much more helpful and not as unpleasant as I somehow feared it would be. But the other thing is that when you tell people you're sick, you're imposing on them, and that there's no getting around that because it implies a reciprocal obligation on their part. They have to know how you are. So if you have the flu, if they see you walking around, that means you're better, right? If you tell me you have cancer, what are they supposed to ask me? Are you dying yet? In fact, that's what they do ask. But how do you ask that question? Like, you're looking good. I'm feeling good. Oh, that's good. By which they mean you don't seem to be dying yet. So the thing is, if you tell somebody you have a chronic disease, and there's no way, you're certainly not going to go into that's why I wrote the book. No, it's, I talked to this doctor and he told me this and that. You don't want to do that because that's a real imposition. And I'm sure we all know from personal experience, people who are very happy tell you everything that ever happened to them, including what they ate for lunch. But if you tell them they are compassionate, and I appreciate that, but then they don't know what to do. They see you 6 months later. Oh, you're still here. Wow. How are you feeling? And as I put it in the book, how are you feeling? And then they say, how are you really feeling? And so I take it in a good-natured manner because I know where they're coming from, because I could very well be in the same position. They're not asking me for for a medical update, which would be inappropriate and wouldn't even answer the question. But they told me, if you tell them you have something which sounds like you could die from it, then the obligation to find out how you are, as awkward as it is, never goes away. So now, is that a reason not to open up? I have learned that it's not a reason, and I'm not sorry that I opened up. But it is one of the reasons I wrote the book, to indicate just how complicated the situation is and how difficult it is to convey in a meaningful and useful way to other people. And some of the responses I've gotten from some people is, and some of them wrote it on as a blurb on the book, is that it reminded them of their own situation when they went through similar things, because they had the same, maybe not the same disease, but they had the same issues. Who do I tell? What do I tell? Who do I ask? Where the heck do I go next? All these questions occur to everybody, more so when it's complex.
All right. Let's talk about religion right now and your experience as a religious Jew who had a serious illness. It doesn't mean that because you're a religious Jew or because you had cancer that you are required to learn something from it. But I'm curious if those dovetailed in some way such that there were certain lessons or anything else that you got out of it together, which might have changed the way you see religiosity or your faith in God.
Well, this is something I've given a lot of thought to, and I'm just going to give you my own personal take without any either medical or religious authority. Historically speaking, ever since Hippocrates, who was either a person or a school, but it doesn't matter, 2,500 years ago, in the Western world, health has been naturalized, by which I mean that it's not spirits, it's not evil spirits, it's not magic, I wouldn't call it science. Science wasn't around then. What he said was, you're healthy if you eat right, if you exercise right, a lot of things that sound very familiar. You live in the right climate that's suitable for where you come from, because I used to believe that you were like plants. You can't put soybeans in Antarctica. So people should stay where they were. Whatever their ideas were, the thing is, the way to keep healthy was to live healthy. And certainly that is an idea that's gone through. So the question is, how do you deal with mentally when you're not healthy, even though you did all the right things? Well, either you blame them on things you did, or then you wonder. So one of the authors that made a big impression on me was a medical historian named Roy Porter, who was a big gadol in medical history. He passed away at a relatively young age, but he wrote 1 million books. And he wrote a book that I came across years ago on the 18th century in England. So he brought all kinds of people, some of them were famous, some less so. One of the things he said is that Anglican bishops, when they wrote letters about their illness, they invoked the Lord because they were Anglican bishops. But what they were really concerned about was getting the best doctor, which is interesting on a number of levels. First of all, what did the best doctor, what did that mean in 18th century England? Or what does it mean in the Tanakh? What does it mean when Yirmiyahu says, Hatzari ein de Gilad im Rofei ein sham? Like, what did that mean? I mean, how did he know that that Tsari in Gilad, the bomb in Gilead, was helpful? I mean, when you try to translate it into modern terminology, you would say, well, like, are there any double-blind controlled studies showing that the bomb is helpful? Which is a really stupid category error question, because nobody thought that way. But they did think that there was a bomb, and they did think that there was a healer, and they did think that God could be their healer. Now, what do people think now? In the shul that I spent most of my life in, and you were there too, so you remember, there are many physicians, many prominent physicians. What do they mean to themselves when they make a mishuberach for a chola? Is it a contradiction in terms? I haven't had long discussions with them, but I have discussions with myself, and it is possible, in my opinion, from my experience of one, to have a feeling that it's important to recognize that there are gaps in medical knowledge and that there are things that doctors don't know and can't know and never will know. And at the same time, have a justifiable faith that the knowledge that doctors do have is of value. Now, can I square that? I'm not a philosopher, and I'm not interested in a neat and comprehensive explanation of how the two can be, how they can be explained as in hearing in the same head of one person. But it's like, as some wag once said, do you believe? And the person said, well, I see it all the time, so I guess I believe. I can't explain it. So I've given you examples through history and through current. I don't view my own views as I said before, as theological views, and I'm not recommending them to anybody. But I'm saying that for many, many millennia now, people have gone to healers because they wanted somebody to heal them. Some people went to shamans and did spells, and some people did dances. But never mind, nobody said, okay, I'm done. I'm going to be stoical, and that's life. Nobody says that, not in a foxhole. And so people have always believed that somebody can offer them something. And until very recently, something was nothing you could measure.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, speaking about providing something, can you give a little bit of chizuk, or maybe explain what are the kinds of ways of getting chizuk or encouragement when either you hear bad news or have to give bad news, or when any of us think about questions of mortality? What would provide chizuk in your mind?
Well, I guess it depends on the individual, but I would say in general, generalizing from my own experience, one thing is to talk about it, which, as I explained, is not my MO or has been. It doesn't do you any good to keep it to yourself. You don't necessarily know what kind of response you're going to get. But the chances are you'll have the same experience or an analogous experience to mine, which is to find that people are sympathetic and they may have useful things to say, not about mortality necessarily, but about who to ask, which doctors to go to. Because like when I started, I practiced 15 minutes walk from all the doctors that I saw, pretty much. And I had no idea what the system was like until I got there. So the question was like, there's a building, there's 5 floors of doctors. What do I do? Knock on the front door? So when you talk to people, you get useful information. You also find out about their experiences, as some people have apparently found my detailing my own experiences, I did in the book, to be of relevance to them, at least in retrospect and possibly going forward. So one thing is to talk about it. And another thing is to, I'm going to find myself repeating myself, just be open to getting information. I called up people who had prostate cancer, some of whom I knew socially a bit, and got to hear about their experiences. And when you find out that people had truly horrendous situations, even worse than mine, and things turned out to be much better than they thought they would, that gives you chizuk as well. Also, if you go to a physician, never mind the nonsense about you want somebody who's a jerk because that means he's really good. That's not how it works at all. And it certainly has not been my experience, whether in the big medical industrial complex or not, that people are actually willing to be honest and also helpful and compassionate. I found a lot of that. I found it in both the U.S. and in Israel. But the system here allowed me to feel it in more of a personal way. And that's certainly not what I was expecting, given what you hear people say about the Israeli medical system, and what they say about the bureaucracy in general, which I am sure has more than a grain of truth to it, but has not been my experience and not been my wife's experience. So by being open to hearing what the deal is professionally and otherwise, when other people have gone through, it's actually a lot of chizuk there.
Okay, thank you. And now finally, talking to people who are not ill, who are interacting with those who are ill, maybe seriously ill, could you give some advice for people who are listening who may have a family member or a friend or an acquaintance who's quite ill and doesn't know exactly how to act, as you already mentioned? What would you say to them?
I would say, you need to know that there's a problem and you need to be able to say something. But you want to say something without being intrusive. It's really similar to if you visit a house at Shiva, Mr. Law Leno. People are going through something. You want to indicate concern, but you don't want to meddle. And that's just common sense. It's hard, and sometimes hard to do. So in other words, you can take your cue from how people respond. If people say, "Thank you very much, appreciate your concern," and give you no other cues, then just let it go. And especially if it's a terminal situation or a chronic situation, it does get irritating if you keep raising it. If you're a close friend, it's a different story. But so you basically have to use just social judgment. There's no right way to do it. Certainly you should express concern, but not take it upon yourself to give advice that's not asked for and to express concern that's not solicited.
Okay, I do have one final question based on something you said earlier, perhaps the most important question of all. Is it true that eating right does not affect acne?
That's always been my opinion. Occasionally, there were studies done. There were terrible studies about proving that chocolate caused acne. But one of the things I learned as a physician is that for many, many conditions, I could tell people my opinion, but they didn't buy it. I thought I could make their life easier, as I thought, by making it unnecessary for them to mortify themselves. And then I realized that I was not doing them any favors. First of all, they didn't buy it. Second of all, they wanted to mortify themselves. That's how I looked at it. Of course, I never said that to them. I found people, not just with acne, with many things, deciding that they were not going to eat X, Y, or Z anymore. And after a while, I just would nod benignly and say, "What, you don't want to eat that?" It seems to help. Things that people do to take care of themselves, a good many ways of treatment are without foundation, but there is no point, I learned, in arguing. No, it's if I think something's going to be actually deleterious, okay, but that was not. You don't want to eat that. Okay, you don't want to wear those kind of clothing. Okay, good to hear. Thank you. But it took me a couple of decades to figure that out, but eventually I did.
Okay, this has been really interesting. I learned a lot, and I think a very important conversation. And I really appreciate, first of all, that you wrote the book, because I learned a lot from it, and I think a lot of people should really read it and gain the wisdom that you've acquired, hard-won wisdom, I can say, and also this conversation today, which was very important for me personally. Dr. Avi Rockoff, I appreciate it. This episode of The Orthodox Conundrum is sponsored by the Eden Project by Rotem Shani, located on Hasavion Street, right across from the Scheinfeld neighborhood in the heart of my hometown of Beit Shemesh. That puts you in a convenient and central location that has easy access to religious ganim, schools, shuls, and shopping, but is also surrounded by trees and parks and overlooks the Elah Valley. The development will include 5 beautifully designed and spacious apartment buildings, and this isn't just a typical complex. This is a community that will be nurtured by a shul with a wonderful rabbinic couple. I can't emphasize enough how impressed I am that Rabbi and Rebbetzin Benny and Chani Krohn of the Young Israel of Teaneck will be making aliyah and leading the spiritual development of this project in order to create a kehillah with an unwavering commitment to Torah values, Ahavat Yisrael, and the core principles of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. As you likely know, the Krohns are a wonderful and beloved rabbinic family. As a Beit Shemesh resident myself, I'm excited to watch how much their being part of the Eden Project will make this development unique and religiously impactful. For more information, please contact Rena Weinberg by emailing info@edenbeitshemesh.com. That's info@edenbeitshemesh.com. You can find the link in the description of this podcast. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.